Hello guys, welcome to CADS 3853, module number 4. In this module, we are going to take a look at some examples of the P&L statements of real-life apparel companies. So here are the P&L statement of the fiscal year 2014 from three companies that we are very familiar with, Abercrombie & Fitch, J. Crew, and Ralph Lauren. These three companies, all the dollars that are shown here are in millions of US dollars. So it's not that Abercrombie & Fitch made $3,744 in sales, but it's $3,744 million for the other companies as well. And so by looking at these, the dollar figures of these five components of the P&L statement, net sales, cost of goods sold, gross margin, operating expenses, and profit and loss, you can kind of see the size of the company, right? For example, among these three companies, net sales are highest for Ralph Lauren, and Ralph Lauren probably made sales that is about like twice the size of the Abercrombie & Fitch's sales. And J. Crew seems to be making the lowest sales there. Cost of goods sold, if you look at cost of goods sold, Ralph Lauren seems to again spend the most in the cost of goods sold. As much as they're selling, they also have to purchase this or make this merchandise that they're selling, so that there's the cost that is involved in getting the merchandise ready, etc. But it still doesn't kind of give us a quite clear idea, besides the size of the company, the scope of the company, how effective or efficient their operation is. So that kind of makes us wonder how we can actually compare like competitor companies in terms of who's doing better in their operations and things like that. And then the next slides, we'll take a look at the percentage figures as well. So now we're looking at the P&L statement in terms of the percentages for the same year, fiscal year 2014, the same three companies. Net sales are always 100%, so all three companies are same. But in that now you can take a look at the cost of goods sold percent. We can clearly see that J. Crew has the highest cost of goods sold percentage. Gross margin is highest for Abercrombie & Fitch. And operating expenses are highest for Abercrombie & Fitch as well. On the other hand, the profit is highest for Ralph Lauren. Okay, so when it comes to how efficient and effective their operations are, if you think about it, when we try to maximize our profit, we wanted to increase net sales and decrease cost of goods sold and operating expenses, right? And basically, by increasing net sales and decreasing cost of goods sold, we are eventually wanting to maximize our gross margin. If you look at the gross margin of these three companies, Abercrombie & Fitch is making the highest gross margin percentage. So in terms of the conversion of the net sales into a gross margin, Abercrombie & Fitch is the highest, and followed by Ralph Lauren and J. Crew. What this means is that Abercrombie & Fitch probably are charging a little bit higher price as compared to its cost, right? If you look at J. Crew, their gross margin is only 37.6%. That means either they are not charging high price for their customer, not putting high margin, or they are having a difficulty in selling their merchandise at the regular price, so that they had to take a lot of markdowns, which leads to high percentage of cost of goods sold and low percentage of gross margin. Although Abercrombie & Fitch has the highest gross margin, which is great, if you look at the operating expenses, they also spend the most in operating expenses in terms of the ratio, the percentage-wise. 58% of the net sales are spent on operating expenses, which gives them very tiny little profit. Okay? Whereas if you look at Ralph Lauren, their operating expenses are kind of in the middle, middle of these three companies, and because their gross margin was high enough, they can actually make a lot more profit percent, 14%. Right? So by using the percentage figures, although these three companies are operating in a very different size or scope of scale, we can still compare these three companies in terms of their effectiveness of their operation and which part of the operation they're doing well, which part they may need to work on more, and things like that. For example, Abercrombie and Fitch may need to work more on reducing operating expenses to maximize their profit. J.Crew, clearly they need to work on reducing cost of goods sold and increasing gross margin. Okay, that means they may have to do a more accurate planning of what the customers like so that they can sell more stuff at a higher price or regular price. Or they need to negotiate with vendors so that they can actually do something about reducing the cost that they're paying to the vendor. Either way, they will have to look into more to be able to figure out which is the cause of the problem. So in any case, rather than the dollar figures, which can give us the information about the size of the company, other than that, rather than the dollar figures, percentage figures are a lot easier for us to compare between companies, and if it was within the company, between different departments and different stores, their evaluation of their performance. When we evaluate a company's performance, we don't just look at and don't just compare its performance with the competitors' performances, but also we like to look at the industry average, whether we are doing better or worse than the industry average. Sometimes the U.S. Census Bureau collect this, they survey a lot of the retail industry, retail businesses, and try to figure out what would be the industry average. They announce the average gross margin and things like that and on an annual basis. If we take a look at for the most recent 4 years data that they produced, in 2014, 45% was the industry average gross margin percent for clothing and clothing accessories stores category. In 2013, it was 46%. In 2012, 45.7. So you can kind of see that the industry average gross margin is kind of somewhere between 45 and 46%. Then going back to the three company examples, if the industry average gross margin is around 45, 46%, then how are these three companies are doing as compared to the industry average? Abercrombie & Fitch gross margin 61%, very high, a whole lot above the industry average gross margin. They are doing well in terms of gross margin aspect, so they are doing maybe a little bit too well. J.Crew is below the industry average. They need to work on it. Ralph Lauren is doing well. They're probably charging premium prices using their luxury image. So we can make some recommendations for these companies as we already did while we were taking a look at their the P&L percentages, the P&L skeleton before. Abercrombie & Fitch needs to work on the operating expenses, but not necessarily on the gross margin aspect. J.Crew will need to work a whole lot more on the reducing the cost or being able to command a higher price premium or be able to sell the merchandise at a regular price more, that kind of things that they have to work on to be able to go up in their gross margin so that eventually they can have a higher profit. And of course, we also analyze our performances, not only just looking at competitors' performances or the industry average, but also we compare ourselves against ourselves by looking at changes over the years. So here is the example of the Abercrombie & Fitch. And we are looking at the P&L skeleton or statement of the fiscal year 2013 and fiscal year 2014. We can see the changes in revenue, cost of goods sold, gross margin, operating expenses, and profit loss. Revenue is the same as sales in this case. So let's try to calculate how the net sales of the Abercrombie & Fitch actually changed between 2013 and 2014, which means what is the trend in net sales for the Abercrombie & Fitch between these 2 years. Okay, you guys remember the trend calculation formula? Okay, trend in net sales will be equal to this year's net sales minus last year's net sales, and divide the answer by last year's net sales, and you time that by 100%. Okay, and we can do the same thing for profit. So profit of Abercrombie & Fitch between 2013 and 2014, what's the trend? How did it change? Well, let's do the same thing. This year's profit minus last year's profit over last year's profit. So in this case, this year means a later year, so that's 2014, and last year is 2013. Okay, let's work on this problem while pausing the video a while. Okay, let's check out the answer. So in terms of net sales between 2013 and 2014, 2014 sales was $3,744 million, whereas 2013 sales was $4,116 million. So you subtract your last year's or 2013 sales from 2014 sales and divide that by 2013 sales, last year's sales. The sales are the same as revenues in this case, and that indicates a negative 9.06% trend in sales, which means because this is a negative sign in the trend number, the negative sign indicates there is a decrease. So even if we didn't know what their this year's and last year's sales were, by looking at this trend number, if we just hear that okay, the trend between 2013 and 2014 was negative 9.06%, then we instantly know that there has been a decrease between the 2 years. In this case, the net sales have decreased by 9.06% between 2013 and 2014 for Abercrombie & Fitch. And we do similar calculations using the profit figures. So 2014 profit was about $151.7 million, and 2013 profit was $185.97 million. So if we take the 2014 profit minus 2013 profit, the previous year for profit, and you divide that by the earlier year 2014 profit, that the answer was negative 18.43%. Again, there's a negative sign for the trend number, so that means profit decreased because it's a negative by 18.43% between 2013 and 2014. Okay, this concludes module number 4. Don't forget to work on module problem assignment number 4. And thanks for listening. Bye-bye.